Before we begin, if you enjoy deep historical documentaries exploring the books, ideas, and people that shaped our world, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us create more long-form documentaries like this one and allows us to continue researching fascinating topics from history, warfare, philosophy, economics, and geopolitics. And now, let's go back to the 17th century, to a philosopher whose ideas may explain not only World War II, but the world we still live in today. Part 1. The world without a Leviathan. Imagine a world with no government, no police, no courts, no laws, no international organizations, no authority capable of enforcing order. A world where every individual, community, and nation exist in a permanent struggle for survival. According to Thomas Hobbes, this was not merely a hypothetical scenario, it was the natural condition of humanity before the creation of political authority. To understand why Hobbes wrote Leviathan, we must first understand the world in which he lived. Born in 1588, the same year the Spanish Armada threatened England, Hobbes witnessed one of the most turbulent periods in British history. Europe was fractured by religious wars, dynastic rivalries, economic instability, and political upheaval. The old certainties that had governed society for centuries were beginning to collapse. The defining event of Hobbes's life was the English Civil War. Beginning in 1642, England descended into chaos as Parliament and the monarchy fought for control of the nation. Families divided, communities collapsed, violence spread across the countryside, neighbors became enemies, authority disappeared in many regions. The conflict demonstrated how quickly civilization could unravel when institutions lost legitimacy. For Hobbes, the lesson was terrifying. Human beings often imagine themselves as rational, cooperative, and moral. Yet when fear dominates society and authority disappears, people become driven by more primitive instincts. Competition for resources, distrust of others, and the desire for self-preservation create an environment in which conflict becomes inevitable. This observation became the foundation of Leviathan, published in 1651. Hobbes described the state of nature, a condition in which no common authority exists to regulate human behavior. Contrary to later romantic visions of humanity living peacefully in nature, Hobbes believed that such a condition would produce insecurity and violence. Every person would possess the freedom to pursue their own interests, but everyone else would possess the same freedom. The result would be uncertainty, fear, and perpetual competition. His most famous phrase captured this reality. Life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, peace was not natural, order was not automatic, stability was not guaranteed. Civilization itself was an achievement requiring constant maintenance. The solution was the creation of the Leviathan. In biblical tradition, Leviathan was a gigantic sea monster of immense power. Hobbes borrowed this image to describe the state. Individuals voluntarily surrender certain freedoms to a central authority capable of maintaining order. The state becomes powerful enough to deter violence, enforce agreements, and protect society from internal collapse. This was not merely a political theory, it was a survival strategy. The fear of chaos was greater than the fear of authority. According to Hobbes, people obey governments not because rulers are morally superior, but because the alternative is worse. Without authority, society risks descending into endless conflict. The genius of Hobbes was recognizing that power and security are inseparable. Every stable society requires institutions capable of enforcing rules. Every functioning economy depends upon predictable order. Every community relies upon some form of authority. For centuries, Leviathan influenced philosophers, political leaders, military strategists, and statesmen. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hobbes's theory is that it extends beyond domestic politics. What happens when we apply Hobbes's ideas not to individuals, but to nations? Within a country, governments act as leviathans. They enforce laws and maintain order. But internationally, no world government exists. No global police force possesses absolute authority over sovereign states. Nations remain free to pursue their own interests. In this sense, the international system resembles Hobbes's state of nature. Countries compete for power, resources, influence, and security. Alliances form and collapse. Trust remains limited. Military strength becomes a critical source of protection. Every state must constantly consider the intentions and capabilities of others. This insight would become increasingly important during the 20th century. As Europe moved toward catastrophe, Hobbes's warnings appeared more relevant than ever. The world was about to witness what happens when fear, insecurity, and competition dominate international politics. The stage was set for the greatest conflict in human history. Part 2. World War II and the collapse of order. By the 1930s, the international system was beginning to resemble the very condition Hobbes had feared centuries earlier. The First World War had ended with promises of peace, cooperation, and collective security. The League of Nations was created with the hope that diplomacy could prevent another global catastrophe. Yet beneath the surface, the world remained governed by fear, insecurity, and competition. Germany emerged from the Treaty of Versailles, humiliated and weakened. Economic crises devastated entire societies. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Political extremism flourished. Across Europe and Asia, governments increasingly viewed military power as the ultimate guarantee of survival. The League of Nations possessed ideals, but it lacked the authority to enforce them. Like Hobbes's state of nature, the international system contained rules without a sovereign capable of guaranteeing compliance. Adolf Hitler understood this reality. While many leaders spoke of peace, he believed power determined outcomes. Germany rearmed at a remarkable pace. The Rhineland was remilitarized. Austria was annexed. Czechoslovakia was dismantled. Each success reinforced the perception that force achieved what diplomacy could not. At the same time, Imperial Japan expanded across Asia, seeking resources and strategic dominance. Italy pursued imperial ambitions in Africa and the Mediterranean. Around the world, nations increasingly viewed international politics as a struggle for survival rather than cooperation. The outbreak of war in 1939 demonstrated the collapse of the existing order. Agreements failed. Guarantees proved insufficient. Diplomacy could not stop invasion. The world entered a period that closely resembled Hobbes's description of life without an effective Leviathan. The Second World War became more than a military conflict. It became a demonstration of what occurs when fear governs decision-making. Every nation sought security. Every alliance formed to counter another threat. Every military campaign was justified as necessary for survival. By 1941, the conflict had become global. Europe burned, Asia erupted in warfare. Entire populations faced destruction. Technological advances multiplied the scale of violence beyond anything Hobbes could have imagined. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, strategic bombing, and mechanized armies transformed warfare into an industrial enterprise. Yet even amidst the chaos, a lesson was becoming increasingly clear. If the world survived this conflict, it would require a new system. The old order had failed. The League of Nations had proven incapable of restraining aggressive states. International anarchy had produced catastrophe. The question facing world leaders was simple but profound. Could a global Leviathan be created? By the 1930s, the international system looked increasingly like the world Thomas Hobbes had warned about nearly 3 centuries earlier. The First World War had supposedly been the war to end all wars. Millions had died. Empires had collapsed. Entire generations had been scarred by industrialized slaughter. In response, world leaders promised that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The League of Nations was established to preserve peace through diplomacy and collective security. Yet beneath these noble ideals, the fundamental realities of power remained unchanged. Hobbes argued that when no superior authority exists to enforce rules, individuals eventually begin to fear one another. That fear leads to competition. Competition leads to insecurity. Insecurity leads to conflict. This dynamic, which Hobbes described among individuals, also applies to nations. Unlike citizens living within a state, countries have no global sovereign standing above them. No world government possesses the power to force compliance from every nation. As a result, the international system naturally tends toward competition and mistrust. The League of Nations attempted to overcome this problem through cooperation, but it possessed one fatal weakness. It had rules, yet lacked the power to enforce them. It could condemn aggression, but it could not reliably stop it. It could issue resolutions, but it could not guarantee obedience. The first major test came in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria. The League condemned the action. Investigations were conducted. Reports were written. Diplomatic protests followed. Yet Japan simply ignored them. No meaningful military response occurred. The lesson was clear. Determined states could violate international norms without suffering decisive consequences. A few years later, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Once again, the League responded with sanctions and criticism. Once again, enforcement proved weak. Mussolini understood that words without power rarely alter outcomes. The invasion succeeded. The credibility of collective security suffered another devastating blow. Meanwhile, Germany was undergoing a transformation that would change the course of history. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe restrictions on Germany after the First World War. Many Germans viewed the settlement as humiliating. Economic crises intensified public anger. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. The Great Depression destroyed jobs and stability. Political extremism flourished. Into this environment stepped Adolf Hitler. Hitler understood something that Hobbes would have recognized immediately. Fear is a powerful political force. He promised security, national revival, military strength, and protection from perceived enemies. He argued that Germany's survival depended upon rejecting weakness and reclaiming power. As Germany rearmed, neighboring countries faced a dilemma still studied by political scientists today: the security dilemma. When one state increases its military capabilities for defensive purposes, other states often interpret those actions as threatening. They respond by strengthening themselves. The result is a cycle of fear and escalation. Germany claimed it sought security. France felt threatened. Britain grew concerned. The Soviet Union became increasingly suspicious. Each side interpreted events through its own fears and interests. By 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. This move violated previous agreements, yet no significant military response followed. Encouraged by success, Germany continued pushing boundaries. Austria was annexed in 1938. Soon afterward, pressure mounted against Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement became one of the defining moments of the era. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain hoped compromise could preserve peace. He accepted German territorial demands in exchange for promises of restraint. Upon returning to Britain, Chamberlain famously declared that he had secured peace for our time. History would judge the agreement differently. For Hitler, the lack of resistance reinforced an important lesson. Bold action produced results. For Hobbes, this outcome would not have been surprising. In a system without a supreme authority capable of enforcing agreements, promises remain dependent upon power. Trust alone is rarely sufficient. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. What followed was one of the clearest demonstrations of international anarchy in modern history. Alliances shifted, armies mobilized, entire societies transformed for war. Every major power acted according to its perception of national interest and survival. The conflict expanded rapidly. Germany conquered much of Europe. The Soviet Union fought for survival following Operation Barbarossa. Japan pursued expansion throughout Asia and the Pacific. The United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. At every stage, Hobbes' central insight remained visible. Nations behaved as though they existed in a dangerous environment where security could never be guaranteed. Fear drove decisions, power determined outcomes. Survival became the highest priority. The war itself revealed the terrifying consequences of this reality. Technological innovation magnified destruction. Strategic bombing targeted entire cities. Industrial production fueled unprecedented military campaigns. Tens of millions of people died. Yet amid the devastation, world leaders began recognizing a crucial truth. Victory alone would not solve the underlying problem. Germany could be defeated, Japan could surrender, but unless the international system itself changed, future conflicts would remain possible. The challenge facing Allied leaders was therefore far larger than winning the war. They needed to design a world capable of preserving peace after the fighting ended. In Hobbesian terms, they faced a familiar problem. How do you create order in a world naturally inclined toward competition? How do you prevent fear from producing another catastrophe? How do you build a Leviathan large enough to preserve stability without destroying freedom? These questions would shape the final years of the war and define the construction of the post-war world order. The answer would become one of the most ambitious political projects in human history. Part 3. Building the post-war Leviathan. As Allied victory became increasingly likely, political leaders began planning for a new world order. They understood that defeating Germany and Japan would not be enough. Unless the underlying causes of instability were addressed, future wars remained inevitable. For Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the challenge resembled the problem Hobbes described centuries earlier. How could order emerge from chaos? How could security be maintained without returning to perpetual conflict? The answer was institutions. In 1944, representatives from dozens of nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There, they designed a new economic framework intended to stabilize international finance and reduce the economic turmoil that had contributed to global conflict. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank emerged from these discussions. Their purpose was not merely economic, they were instruments of stability. A year later, another institution would take shape. The United Nations represented humanity's most ambitious attempt to create a rules-based international order. Unlike the League of Nations, the UN incorporated the realities of power politics. The Security Council granted special authority to the major victorious powers, acknowledging that global order could not exist without the participation of the strongest states. At the same time, the Nuremberg trials introduced a revolutionary principle. For the first time, political and military leaders were held individually accountable for crimes committed during war. The message was clear: power would no longer exist entirely outside legal constraints. Europe's reconstruction further demonstrated the importance of institutional cooperation. The Marshall Plan provided economic assistance on an unprecedented scale. Former enemies became economic partners. Integration gradually replaced rivalry. In many respects, the post-war system represented an attempt to create a limited international Leviathan. It was not a world government. Nations remained sovereign, yet institutions now existed to manage disputes, facilitate cooperation, and reduce incentives for conflict. For decades, this framework helped sustain relative stability. International trade expanded, economic growth accelerated, cooperation increased. The horrors of the Second World War remained a constant reminder of what unchecked competition could produce. Yet Hobbes's insight remained relevant. Institutions could reduce insecurity, but they could not eliminate it entirely. Part 4. And final, the Cold War, the modern world, and Hobbes's last question. The end of World War II did not eliminate competition between states. Instead, it transformed it. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers, each possessing immense military, economic, and ideological influence. Once again, Hobbes's logic appeared unavoidable. Both sides feared the intentions of the other. Both expanded military capabilities. Both formed alliances. Both sought strategic advantages. The Cold War became a global struggle shaped by mutual insecurity. Yet an extraordinary paradox emerged. Nuclear weapons created a situation unlike anything in previous history. The destructive power of atomic arsenals became so immense that direct conflict between superpowers risked mutual annihilation. Fear itself became a stabilizing force. This was Hobbesian logic on a global scale. The balance of terror prevented large-scale war, not because nations trusted one another, but because they feared the consequences of conflict. Security emerged from deterrence rather than cooperation alone. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many observers believed a new era had begun. Democracy expanded, globalization accelerated. International institutions appeared stronger than ever. Some even suggested that major power conflict had become obsolete. History proved more complicated. The 21st century introduced new forms of competition. Cyber warfare blurred the line between peace and conflict. Economic interdependence created both cooperation and vulnerability. Emerging powers challenged existing structures. Information warfare transformed political influence. Artificial intelligence introduced new strategic uncertainties. The rise of China, renewed tensions among major powers, and growing challenges to international institutions raise questions that Hobbes would immediately recognize. Can order survive without overwhelming authority? Can rules restrain competition when security is at stake? Can cooperation endure in a world of competing interests? More than 3 centuries after the publication of Leviathan, these questions remain unresolved. The institutions built after World War II continue to shape global affairs. The United Nations still operates. The IMF and World Bank remain influential. International law continues to evolve, yet nations continue to compete for power, resources, technology, and influence. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of Hobbes. Order is not permanent. Stability is not automatic. Peace is not self-sustaining. Every generation must rebuild and defend the institutions that make cooperation possible. The story of the 20th century can therefore be understood as a struggle between 2 forces, anarchy and order. World War II revealed the dangers of a world without effective constraints. The post-war era represented humanity's attempt to construct a system capable of preventing a return to chaos. Whether that system will endure remains one of the defining questions of our time. And as we look toward the future, from artificial intelligence to cyber conflict, from geopolitical rivalry to global economic competition, Hobbes' warning continues to echo across the centuries. Without order, fear dominates. Without institutions, power rules. Without a Leviathan, the world risked returning to the very condition humanity has spent centuries trying to escape. The question is no longer whether Hobbes understood the world of his time. The question is whether he still understands ours.